Hey guys, and welcome back to a new video. In this video, you will learn about the so-called navigation rail in Material 3. In the last video, you have learned about the bottom navigation bar, which is only used for navigation, so we can click these different destinations here, and then you should navigate to different screens based on where the user clicks on. However, you will notice if you use this on tablet devices, especially in landscape mode, then this is not very good UX. So these different destinations have a lot of space in between, so you would need to move your thumbs quite far to click on these different destinations. And that is why Material 3 also introduces a different way of navigation, which has the same purpose as the bottom navigation bar, just for tablets and larger screens. And this is called the navigation rail. You can see it here on the left, so we can have an optional menu icon similar to the top app bar. We can have an optional floating action button, which would be located here. And down here, we have the different screen destinations, which are just the same as in the bottom navigation bar. And for larger screens like a tablet, this just has much better usability for your users. And to implement this, the first thing I want to do is I want to define a wrapper class for each of these different navigation items. So on the one hand, we want to have an icon, a selected and an unselected icon. You can see when it's selected, then it's actually filled, and otherwise it's outlined. We then want to have a title that we can assign. We want to be able to assign such a badge count to also display, for example, unread messages, and such a normal badge in case there's, for example, an update where you just want the user to click on this specific destination. And this is actually exactly the same as what we did in the previous video about bottom navigation views. So I am here in an empty Material 3 Jetpack Compose project, and we want to start by creating a little wrapper class here for our navigation items. Each item will take a title, an unselected icon, which is an image vector. We want to have a selected icon. We want to have an optional badge count, which is null by default. So if we leave it at null, then we don't show a badge at all. And we're going to have a variable has news, which will indicate whether we want to show this little red bubble here or not without a specific count. And then for the sake of this video, I will just paste my list of items here for our navigation rail. In this case, you can also just copy paste this from the GitHub link down below, or just create your own icons and items. So you can see we have a home action where the selected icon is the filled home icon. The unselected one is the same, just from the outline category. We don't have a news for that. We don't want to show a badge for the navigation item number 2. We have a chat email icon. We have the has news being equal to false, but here we have a badge count of 45. So we show this little counter next to the icon. And finally, settings, where we set has news to true. But feel free to use your own icons here. And first of all, before we start to implement the navigation rail, we need to find out if we should show that at all, because the navigation rail should only be shown on screens with a window size class of at least medium. So we do have these different window size classes, which we can get with this here. So window class is equal to calculate window size class, and we pass our activity. You probably won't have this function because you need to include this window size class dependency here. So that's basically always used when you want to find out what kind of screen size the user is currently on, to then show some views or not show them. We need to hit Alt Enter on this and opt in for this experimental API as usual on Android. And now this window class can either be compact for just smaller screens like phones. It can be medium for, I think it's tablets, and it can be large for desktop screens. And we only want to show our navigation rail on screens that have a window class of at least medium. So val show navigation rail is equal to window class not equals window class, window size class dot, actually window width size class dot compact. So on compact devices, we don't want to show this, but on all others, we do want this. And the error is the operator cannot be applied. I think we need to refer to the width size class. So let's put this on a separate line. So if we're not on a compact screen, if we're not on a phone, then we'll just show the navigation rail and otherwise not. So let's actually put that in a separate composable down here. Composable. I will just call it navigation sidebar. I think that's a bit more intuitive than a rail. This will take in a list of our navigation items. This will take a selected item index. So this will be the index of the item that is selected. And it will have an onNavigate lambda, which gives us the new index when we click on a specific item, so we can navigate to that corresponding destination. If you're dealing with the navigation destinations here, then that is typically a string, so the route is a string. Then you could also call this selected route, make it a string, and automatically navigate to that route when you click on the item. But I do have another video about navigation and how we implement that. So in here, we want to have a so-called navigation rail. This navigation rail can take some optional parameters. On the one hand, modifier, that should be clear. Container color, content color, we shouldn't change these because then we stick to the Material3 guidelines by default. We do have the option to pass a header. The header is basically just what is displayed at the very top of our rail. So if we take a look here, then we can use the header to display this menu item. So if we would click on this, we could show a navigation drawer, which I will also talk about in this playlist. And we can have an optional floating action button like this. It is not recommended to put anything else in that header other than these two items, and both these are optional, so you can also just show a floating action button or just show such a menu item or none at all. But if you want to show something in the header, then only these two composables. So we could have an icon button in here. When we click that, we would open our navigation drawer, and the icon will be this one here, icons default menu. And the content description could just be menu. Below that, we could have a floating action button, which also gets an icon, whatever you want. For example, default add, to have a little plus icon, whatever that might be useful for. And then here, the content description could be add. One rule or one guideline of Material3 is that if we have a floating action button, which is nested in a different composable, so in this case in our navigation rail, then it should not have an elevation. By default, a floating action button has an elevation and therefore a shadow, which would just highlight it a little bit too much. So we want to remove the elevation by saying elevation is equal to floating action button defaults dot bottom app bar fab elevation. So we will use the same elevation we also use for the floating action bar if it's placed inside of a bottom app bar, which I've also already made a video about in this playlist. And you can see the elevation here is 0 dp for all cases. Next up, we do have this piece of code here, and that is the actual content of our navigation rail. So in our case, the actual navigation items. Here we do get a column scope, so we could directly loop over our items list here and say items for each indexed. We get the index, we get the item, and then we could place a navigation rail item here. It is selected if our selected item index is equal to the current index we are looping over. And then on click, well, here we do want to call our onNavigate lambda with our current index. So we, if we click on a specific rail item here, then we get the actual current index, so in this case 1 of that specific item. We propagate it up with this lambda here, and then we update our selected item index, so we navigate to the different destination. The icon is simply a normal icon. The image vector is dependent on whether this item is selected or not. But let's leave this blank for now, because we want to also have our logic with showing badges here, just like for our bottom navigation view. Let's just format that a little bit and implement the icon in a minute. The last thing we want to have here is a label, which is just a text. So the text description of a specific destination, which is just item.title. Okay. Other than that, we don't have too much we can configure here. We can disable a specific option. We can always show the label, which is true by default, but we can also hide the label, so it only shows for the currently active destination. We can change the colors, which I wouldn't recommend, since then you again don't stick to the Material3 guidelines. And other than that, I would say we implement our little icon here. I want to make that a separate composable navigation item like this, or rather, let's call it navigation icon. And in here, this will take our navigation item and it will take our selected Boolean. And the way this works is exactly like for bottom navigation views. So we have a badged box, which is used to display a specific badge. We can then create the badge in here. If the item.badge count is not null, that means we do want to display a specific badge count, then we just display a badge with a text of item badge count.toString. We also want to click on this badge box, Alt Enter, opt into this experimental API. And else, if the item has news, so if we don't want to show a specific badge count, like here for the chat destination, but just show this little red bubble, then this has news Boolean will be true. In this case, we just show a badge without any content, like this. And the badge box will then just arrange the specific badge at the top right corner of whatever we put in here. So in here, this would be our icon. The image vector is now dependent on whether the item is selected. So if selected, then item selected icon, and else item unselected icon. Content description is just item.title. And then we have our navigation icon. So we can use this in here in our navigation rail item, navigation icon. The item is just our item, and selected is whether our selected item index is equal to index. Put this on separate lines. And I think this should be the very first version of our navigation rail. We'll optimize this a little bit. But let's go in here and put in our navigation rail. So with the bottom navigation bar, we could put that in a scaffold, which is the container for these typical Material3 components. What I find a bit confusing is that there is no place for a navigation rail in a scaffold. So we do have a bottom bar, we do have a top bar, we do have a floating action button, but there's nothing for a sidebar or so. So this is what I find quite confusing, especially because the guidelines suggest that you show a bottom bar on compact devices and a navigation rail on larger devices. So you kind of want to use these together, but you only need a scaffold for one of these. So this is quite confusing. I don't know if there is a reason for this, but in that case, you would actually need to have a bottom bar in here, check if you don't want to show the navigation rail, and then have your bottom navigation or so. I don't know. I think it's just called navigation bar. The scaffold would then have a modifier fill max size, and in here we could have some sample content, sample items of a lazy column. So modifier dot fill max size. We apply the padding from the scaffold, and we then have some items. Let's have 100 items and display text for one of for each. So we will have our item $it, so item 1, item 2, and so on. To now display our navigation sidebar, as I said, we can't do that in the scaffold. At least I haven't found a way to make it work reliably. Maybe you could also put it in the bottom bar, but that would be quite confusing, I think, because it's effectively a sidebar, not a bottom bar. So we just put it below our scaffold right here, and only if we want to show the navigation rail. So then we have our navigation rail, navigation rail, actually navigation sidebar, sorry. The items, I don't know why I can't always format this here automatically. Now I can. The items is items. The selected item index is our selected item index, which we haven't yet. That needs to be a state. Let's quickly create this up here. So we have a var selected item index by remember savable mutable state of 0 initially. So we do have the first item selected by default. So in this case, the home item. Remember savable because that survives screen rotations. So we don't reset the destination every time we rotate the device. And we can then take this selected item index and update it here in our onNavigate function to the new index that we get from this lambda. If we launch it like this, you will notice we're not done yet. First of all, that looks quite weird. It should not be centered. Maybe I put it inside the surface. Yes, we need to put it outside the surface, so just one level below. And this window class and show navigation rail and selected item index, all these also have to be above the surface. This should hopefully do it, that it's at least left aligned on our left bar, on our left side. Yes, that looks already better. We can switch between the destinations, but it still doesn't look exactly as before. And also, where is our lazy column? Because we really implemented a scaffold with a lazy column with specific items, but they don't really appear. And we also would like to align these items at the bottom here. According to the guidelines, it's completely fine to have these at the top, also at the center, but I find having them at the bottom the most convenient because that is the closest to the user's thumb, to the left thumb. And the reason these items don't appear is, well, they do appear, but they're just covered by the navigation rail. So if we just make this a little bit longer here, we should see these items. As you can see, so there are a bunch of items, and we also should apply some padding, but they're just covered by this little navigation rail. Let's first of all add some padding to these items. Modifier is modifier dot padding of 16 dp. Alt enter to import dp. So how do we prevent these items from being covered? Well, for that we need to apply the padding or the width of our navigation rail to the content of our screen. And the navigation rail is exactly 80 dp wide. So we need to go to our lazy column and say we have a padding, specifically a start padding. And only if we want to show our navigation rail, this start padding is 80 dp and else it's 0 dp. So if we show a bottom navigation bar instead, then we don't want to have a left padding. If we relaunch this, then we should now see that our content is properly displayed. Yes, now that looks much better. Let's still also see how we can align these items at the bottom. And you've noticed in my other app that there was a little divider here that I've implemented. This is optional and also not the default, but I think this just separates the navigation rail a little bit more from the real content here to just have a very thin and not so prominent divider. Let's see how we can do that. First of all, go to our navigation sidebar. These items, so all of our navigation destination items, need to be put in a column if we want to change the alignment. So we put these in here. And here we can now say modifier is modifier fill max height. And the vertical arrangement is now arrangement that's spaced by, so we want to have a little bit of spacing between our items of 12 dp. That is also, I think, the official guideline. And the alignment should be alignment dot bottom, like this. And how do we achieve this little separator, this little divider? Well, to achieve that, I have become a little bit creative. Maybe you find a better way, but we will make use of the modifier of our navigation rail, and we will basically have a background of the color of our divider behind this navigation rail, and then we move the actual content, the actual navigation rail, just to the left by 1 dp. So only 1 dp of width gets shown from the actual background. And we can do this by going in here, modifier dot background. For this, I like the material theme color scheme inverse on surface. So this is just a little bit a lighter variant of the on surface color. And then we have the background, but still the actual content gets drawn above the background. So this doesn't cause that our navigation rail is now colored completely in this color. So we just want to say we offset this whole navigation rail on the x-axis by -1 dp. So just by 1 dp value to the left. And if we now relaunch this, then it should look exactly like here. Yes, there you go. So we can see this little divider. We can switch between destinations. These are now bottom aligned. And we have our floating action button, we have our menu, which are optional, but you now effectively have a navigation rail in your app. So again, little recap, use this navigation rail if you want to have a navigation bar for tablets and a larger screen, so for desktop screens, and use a bottom navigation bar if you have a navigation bar for phones. If you enjoyed this video, then you will definitely also enjoy my more advanced Android premium courses, which will perfectly prepare you for the industry for an Android development job. If that sounds good to you, check the first link in this video's description. And apart from that, thanks for watching so far. I will see you back in the next one. Bye bye.